On a spring morning in 1940, as France collapsed and the British Army fled toward Dunkirk, a German sergeant walked into an ambush. He died instantly, struck through the heart by a weapon that hadn't killed in warfare for 3 centuries, an English longbow. The archer was Captain Jack Churchill, and his impossible shot would close 10,000 years of military history. This is the story of the last time an arrow killed in war. May 27, 1940. Lepinette, France. 0500 hours. The hay smelled of last summer, sweet, dusty, impossibly distant from this morning of retreat and ruin. Captain John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill lay motionless in the loft of a Norman barn, his fingers wrapped around polished English yew that had no place in this mechanized war. Through gaps in the weathered planking, he watched dawn creep across fields where armies had bled for centuries, where longbowmen had once decided the fate of kingdoms. 600 years separated Agincourt from this moment. 600 years, and yet the weapon in his hands was exactly the same. Below, in the barn's shadows, 37 men of the Manchester Regiment held their breath. They gripped Bren guns and Lee Enfield rifles, modern weapons for a modern war. But their commander, this eccentric officer, who carried a sword into battle and played bagpipes under fire, had chosen something older, something silent, something that belonged to another age entirely. The sound of boots on cobblestones echoed through the morning mist. German voices, casual, confident. The Feldwebel leading the patrol had no reason for caution. The British were fleeing toward Dunkirk. The war, for all practical purposes, was over. France was falling. The Third Reich's western flank was secure. Churchill's finger traced the arrow's fletching. His grandfather had taught him the longbow on the family estate in Ceylon, among tea plantations and colonial certainties. The technique had been passed down through generations, from the professional killers of medieval England to a 21st century eccentric who believed modern warfare had lost something essential. He had competed at archery in the 1939 World Championships. He had hit bullseyes from distances that made spectators gasp. But he had never aimed at a man. Not until this morning. The retreat to Dunkirk was 7 days old, though it felt like 7 years. Operation Dynamo, the desperate evacuation Churchill and his men were fighting to reach, would not begin until the next day, May 28th. But already the roads of northern France were clogged with the wreckage of an army. Trucks burned in ditches. Horses lay dead in their traces. Soldiers stumbled west, hollow-eyed, weaponless, defeated. The Luftwaffe owned the sky. Panzer columns moved faster than retreat could organize itself. The British Expeditionary Force, which had crossed the Channel with such confidence 8 months earlier, was disintegrating. Captain Churchill's company had been assigned to cover the withdrawal, a polite term for standing between 300,000 fleeing men and the most efficient killing machine ever assembled. They had been falling back through Belgium's shattered towns, through France's ancient villages, setting ambushes, buying hours with blood. Churchill had insisted his men maintain discipline, maintain pride. He wore his dress uniform. He carried his Scottish broadsword. He had positioned a gramophone in one foxhole and played The March of the Cameron Men, while bullets snapped overhead. His superiors thought him mad. His men thought him magnificent. Now, in this barn outside Lepinette, he was about to do something that would be remembered long after the campaign was forgotten. Something that would seem, to future historians, almost absurdly impossible. But Jack Churchill, Mad Jack, to those who knew him, had never been particularly interested in what was possible. He was interested in what was effective. The German patrol rounded the corner into the barn's killing ground at 0514 hours. 12 men moving in the loose formation of victors. The Feldwebel sergeant led them, his MP-40 submachine gun slung casually across his chest. He was perhaps 30 years old, fit, professional, a veteran of Poland and now France. He wore his Wehrmacht uniform with the pride of a winning army. His men followed, talking quietly about breakfast, about billets, about the French girls they had seen in the last village. They had no idea they were being watched by 37 rifles, 2 Bren guns, and 1 man with a weapon from the 100 Years' War. Churchill drew the bowstring to his ear, 70 pounds of tension, enough to drive a bodkin point through plate armor. The yew creaked softly, a sound lost beneath the German's footsteps. He had chosen a broadhead arrow, 3 razor-sharp blades designed for hunting, not war, but lethal nonetheless. Through the barn's gaps he could see the Feldwebel's chest, the rise and fall of breath, the small movements of a man who expected to live through this morning. 600 years ago, English archers had stood on French soil and released clouds of arrows that darkened the sky. They had killed knights by the thousand, had broken cavalry charges, had decided battles that shaped Europe. But that age had ended with gunpowder. The longbow had become a curiosity, a sporting weapon, a relic in museums. No army had carried them for centuries. No soldier had killed with one since when? Churchill couldn't remember. Perhaps some colonial skirmish, perhaps some forgotten frontier war. But certainly not in this war, this mechanized, industrialized, modernized slaughter, where men died from artillery miles away, from bombs dropped from unreachable heights, from machine guns that could cut down companies in seconds. The longbow was obsolete. It was ridiculous. It was silent. Churchill released. The arrow crossed 40 meters in less than half a second. It made no sound. The Germans had no warning. The Feldwebel was mid-sentence. Something about coffee, about finding a cafe, when the broadhead punched through his tunic, through his ribcage, through his heart, and erupted from his back in a spray of blood that looked black in the morning shadows. He stopped. His eyes widened. He looked down at the shaft protruding from his chest, wooden, feathered, impossible, and his mind, in its final seconds, must have struggled to understand what century had just killed him. Then he collapsed, and Churchill shouted, "Fire!" and the barn erupted in the thunder of modern weapons. The remaining 11 Germans died in seconds. The Bren guns caught them before they could unsling their weapons. The rifles fired from every gap in the barn's walls. It was efficient, professional, over almost before it began. The Wehrmacht patrol had walked into a perfectly prepared ambush. They never had a chance, but they would have had warning. Seconds, perhaps, but warning nonetheless if Churchill had fired a pistol to signal the attack. They would have heard the shot. Some might have survived the opening volley. Some might have returned fire. British soldiers might have died. Instead, they heard nothing until it was too late. The arrow had been silent. The arrow had been perfect. The arrow had killed a man in a way no soldier would be killed again in the entire Second World War. The Manchester Regiment held Lepinette for 6 more hours. They fought a textbook defensive action, falling back from position to position, making the Germans pay for every meter. When they finally withdrew at noon, they had bought enough time for another 1,000 men to reach Dunkirk's beaches. Churchill was the last to leave, carrying his longbow, his sword, and his bagpipes. His men never forgot what they had seen. The story spread through the remnants of the BEF, even as they waited on Dunkirk's beaches, even as Stukas screamed overhead and shells bracketed the destroyers. A captain had killed a German with a longbow. A captain had reached back 6 centuries to strike a blow for the Allies. It was mad. It was impossible. It was exactly the kind of defiant, eccentric, thoroughly British gesture that an army on the edge of annihilation desperately needed. The German Feldwebel's name is lost to history. He was buried by his comrades somewhere near Lepinette, in soil that held the bones of soldiers from a dozen wars. His death was recorded as combat action, nothing unusual. The Wehrmacht's records did not mention arrows. Why would they? Arrows belong to museums, not battlefields. But British Army records compiled after the war from interviews and after-action reports confirmed the incident. Captain Jack Churchill, Manchester Regiment, killed an enemy soldier with a longbow on May 27, 1940, during the retreat to Dunkirk. It remains the only confirmed longbow kill of World War II. The only confirmed longbow kill, in fact, in any major conflict since the 17th century. Churchill survived Dunkirk. He went on to even more extraordinary exploits: commando raids in Norway, operations in Yugoslavia, capture and escape from German POW camps. He fought through the entire war, always with his broadsword, always with his bagpipes, becoming one of the British Army's most decorated and eccentric officers. He died in 1996, aged 89, having lived long enough to see the Cold War end and a new century approach. He never spoke much about l'Épinette. When pressed, he would simply say that modern weapons were loud and gave warning. Loud weapons got soldiers killed. He preferred quiet. Today, l'Épinette is a quiet farming village in northern France. The barn where Churchill waited is long gone, replaced by a modern structure of concrete and steel. The fields where the German patrol died have been plowed and planted 10,000 times. There is no memorial, no plaque, no marker of what happened on that May morning. But historians of the longbow, and there are more than one might expect, know the story. Archery enthusiasts know it. Military history scholars fascinated by anachronism know it. And occasionally, a veteran of later wars, holding modern weapons that can kill from kilometers away with guided precision, will hear the story and fall silent, imagining what it must have been like to draw a bow on a battlefield, to feel yew and sinew tension in your hands, to release an arrow in a war of tanks and aircraft and artillery. The longbow's last kill was part of a larger story, of course. The ambush at l'Épinette was one small action in the retreat to Dunkirk, which was one campaign in the Battle of France, which was one phase of World War II, which was one conflict in the long, bloody narrative of the 20th century. Individual actions, however extraordinary, are always part of larger patterns. But still, an arrow, 1940, a weapon from Agincourt, used against soldiers who would reach Paris in 3 weeks and the gates of Moscow in a year and a half. The juxtaposition is so stark, so impossible, that it demands attention. It forces us to remember that war, for all its industrial scale and mechanized horror, is still ultimately fought by individual humans making individual choices, and some of those choices are stranger than fiction would dare invent. The arrow Churchill used, if it survived, if it wasn't destroyed or lost in the chaos of war, would be in a museum somewhere now. English yew, hand-carved, fletched with goose feathers, tipped with steel. Children would walk past it without understanding. Adults would glance at it and move on to more dramatic exhibits, tanks, aircraft, the big machines that defined the war. But that arrow ended a man's life on a spring morning in France. It was pulled from a body, German or British, we don't know who retrieved it, and at some point someone recognized it for what it was. Not just an arrow, the last arrow, the final time in history that this weapon, which had ruled battlefields for thousands of years, killed in genuine warfare. Archery would continue, of course. Sport archery, hunting, recreation. Millions of arrows would be loosed in the decades after 1940, but they would strike targets, deer, competition bulls. Never again would an arrow strike a soldier in combat. Never again would a bow be drawn with the intent to kill an enemy of the state. Churchill's arrow closed a chapter of human history that stretched back to the Stone Age. For tens of thousands of years, from the first sharpened stick thrown at prey, through the composite boughs of the steppes, through the English longbows of Crécy and Agincourt, Through the samurai bows of feudal Japan, arrows had been instruments of power. They had decided battles, ended kingdoms, killed kings. The arrow was humanity's first ranged weapon, and for most of history, it was the dominant one. But modernity had made it obsolete. By 1940, the bow was a curiosity, useful for hunting perhaps, entertaining for sport, but not serious, not military, not relevant to wars fought with machine guns and bombers and eventually atomic weapons. Except for one morning, one moment, one man who believed the old ways still had value. The Manchester Regiment men who witnessed the shot never forgot it. But they also understood it was a gesture, not a tactical innovation. No one suggested equipping British soldiers with longbows. No military theorist proposed reviving archery as a combat technique. The longbow's effectiveness at Lepinette was entirely dependent on specific, unrepeatable circumstances, a prepared position, an unsuspecting enemy, a commander skilled enough to make an impossible shot. And yet the gesture mattered. In those desperate May days of 1940, when the British Army was being driven into the sea, when France was collapsing, when Hitler seemed unstoppable, a small defiant act of eccentricity reminded soldiers that they were more than machines. They were inheritors of traditions. They were part of a long story of resistance and courage. They were British, and being British meant you could be perfectly professional and perfectly mad at the same time. Churchill understood this. His bagpipes, his sword, his longbow, these weren't just affectations. They were deliberate choices to remember that soldiering was an ancient craft, not just a modern industrial process. He inspired his men not despite his eccentricity, but because of it. They followed him because he refused to let the machinery of modern war strip away their humanity, their humor, their connection to something older and deeper than the Third Reich's mechanized brutality. The longbow at Lepinette was Churchill's way of saying, we remember. We remember Agincourt. We remember Crécy. We remember that this land has been fought over for 1,000 years, and every time, eventually, the invaders are driven out. France falls, but France also rises. Armies retreat, but armies return. This war, like all wars, will end. And when it does, the old values, courage, honor, defiance, will still matter. On May 28, 1940, the day after Lepinette, Operation Dynamo began. Over 9 days, more than 338,000 Allied soldiers were evacuated from Dunkirk's beaches, a disaster transformed into deliverance. Churchill's company, which had helped cover the retreat, was among them. They crossed the Channel on a destroyer under Luftwaffe attack, reached England, and were immediately reformed for continued resistance. The German Feldwebel who died from Churchill's arrow never reached Dunkirk. He was buried near Lepinette, his grave eventually lost among thousands of others. His family received a notification, killed in action, 27th May, France. They mourned him as families have mourned soldiers for millennia. They never knew how he died. They never knew he was the last man in history killed by a longbow in warfare. Perhaps it wouldn't have mattered to them. Dead is dead, whether from an arrow or a bullet or a shell. Grief doesn't distinguish between weapons. The widow's tears are the same. The children's loss is identical. But for historians, for those who think about how warfare evolves and what it means, the detail matters enormously. It matters because it marks an ending, not just of one man's life, but of an entire category of human violence. After Lepinette, the bow's military history was finished, complete, closed, and it matters because it reminds us that endings are never clean. History doesn't close one chapter and open another with neat precision. Instead, the old and new overlap, intermingle, create bizarre moments where the past and future collide. A medieval weapon in a modern war, A man from the age of empire fighting the age of totalitarianism with techniques from the age of feudalism. These collisions are jarring, confusing, sometimes darkly comic, but they're also deeply human. We carry our past with us, even into futures that seem to have no place for it. We remember old skills, old ways, old values. Sometimes remembering is just sentiment. Sometimes it's nostalgia. And sometimes, rarely, but sometimes it's tactically effective. Churchill's arrow was all three. The longbow as a weapon is approximately 10,000 years old. Archaeological evidence shows archery in use by 8000 BCE. By the time of recorded history, every culture on Earth had developed some form of bow. It was, quite simply, the first technology that allowed humans to kill at range. Before bows, you needed to get close to your prey or enemy, close enough to thrust a spear, close enough to swing a club, close enough to risk retaliation. The bow changed everything. Suddenly hunters could strike from concealment. Warriors could kill before their enemies reached them. Battles became less about individual strength and more about coordination, training, massed fire. The bow was the first true force multiplier. A trained archer was worth multiple untrained fighters. English longbows, specifically, represented the pinnacle of medieval archery. A 6-foot stave of yew, capable of launching an arrow over 250 meters with enough force to penetrate armor. English archers trained from childhood. Their skeletons, excavated from medieval graves, showed distinctive deformities from the enormous draw weights they pulled throughout their lives. They were specialists, professionals, the elite troops of their age, and they dominated. At Crécy in 1346, English archers slaughtered French knights. At Poitiers in 1356, they did it again. At Agincourt in 1415, 6,000 archers defeated a French army 4 times their size. The longbow made England a superpower, but gunpowder ended the longbow's military dominance. By the 16th century, firearms were more effective. By the 17th century, no army fielded bowmen. By the 19th century, the longbow was a historical curiosity. By 1940, it was utterly irrelevant to modern warfare, except for one shot. One morning. One man who proved that sometimes, under exactly the right circumstances, the old ways still work. Captain Churchill retired from the British Army in 1959 with the rank of lieutenant colonel. He spent his remaining years surfing, training as a parachutist, and teaching archery. He never claimed to be anything special, just a soldier who believed warfare should have style as well as substance. When interviewers asked about his eccentricity, he would quote what he believed had been his philosophy throughout the war. Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. He was joking, mostly, but also not joking at all. Churchill genuinely believed modern warfare had lost something essential, not effectiveness. He acknowledged that machine guns and artillery were superior killing tools. But something about honor, about tradition, about maintaining connection to the long history of soldiering. His weapons were symbols as much as tools. They said, "We remember. We are part of something older than this particular war. We fight with modern weapons, but we remember what warriors have always been." The longbow at L'Épinette was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. Churchill could have used a pistol to signal the ambush. It would have been simpler, more conventional, expected. But he chose the bow because it was silent, yes, but also because it was a statement about continuity, about defiance, about refusing to let the Germans or modernity or the machinery of industrial warfare strip away his sense of connection to England's military heritage. It was, in its way, perfect. A German soldier representing a regime that fetishized modernity and mechanization and industrial efficiency, killed by a weapon from an age when warfare was personal, when soldiers looked their enemies in the eye, when battles were decided by individual skill and courage rather than by factories and logistics. Hitler's Wehrmacht was the most modern military force ever assembled in 1940. They had panzer tanks, Stuka dive bombers, motorized infantry, coordinated radio communications, blitzkrieg tactics that rewrote military doctrine. They were unstoppable, and one of them died from an arrow. The irony would have pleased Churchill immensely. No memorial marks the spot where the Feldwebel fell. Lepinette has no tourist trade based on the incident. Most residents of the village probably don't know the story. It's too small, too strange, too easily lost among the immense tragedies and triumphs of World War II. But for those who do know, for archers, for military historians, for anyone fascinated by the moments when different ages collide, Lepinette represents something profound. It represents the last time a weapon that had served humanity for 10 millennia killed in warfare. It represents the end of the longest continuous military tradition in human history. It represents a closing, a conclusion, a moment when the past finally, definitively, gave way to the future. Except the past never quite disappears. We carry it with us. We remember it. Sometimes we even use it when circumstances permit. Churchill proved that morning that the old skills still had value, not general value, not broad tactical applicability, but specific situational value in exactly the right moment. That's perhaps the deepest truth of Lepinette. Not that the old ways are superior or that we should return to them, but that they're not entirely lost. They're dormant, waiting. Most of the time, modernity serves us well. Most of the time, the newest weapon, the latest tactic, the most efficient method is the right choice. But sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, the old way is better. And when those moments come, it helps to have someone who remembers, someone who trained in the old techniques, someone who carried a longbow to a modern war because he believed the past still had lessons to teach. Captain Jack Churchill was that someone. And on May 27, 1940, in a barn near Lepinette, he proved himself right. The arrow flew. The Feldwebel died. The longbow's military history ended. And somewhere, across centuries of graves, perhaps the archers of Agincourt smiled,